Hey everyone, welcome to part 5 of this tutorial series. In the previous video we looked at connecting to a Xano API from a pre-built form in Nordcraft. In this video we're going to be looking at how to build out that form. So let's get into it. So we're going to be replicating this login form from scratch. Now if you just want to get to the good stuff, then what you can do is to clone the existing project that I've built so that you'll get this form, and then you can just get to the point where you can connect up to your API, your Xano backend. I would recommend that you don't, so that you can learn how to put forms together in Nordcraft and start to learn some of its fundamentals. However, what you can do is if you go to the link that's in the description, which I've put on the screen there as well, if you go to that, obviously you'll need to have your Nordcraft account set up and you'll need to be logged in, but essentially you put that link into the browser and it will take you to this page where you can see the pre-built form, and all you need to do here is to click clone the project, and that will create a new project in Nordcraft for you to then work on with this form and connect your API to your own Xano backend. But if you're still with me wanting to build this form out from scratch, then make sure you're on your Nordcraft dashboard, which you will be taken to when you first log in. And what you can do is to click create a project, and it will ask you, do you want to build from a template? Now in this case we're just going to build from scratch with a blank template, so let's click that. So let's give it a project name. It doesn't matter at this point, you can go back and change it if you like, so I'm just going to call it app demo for now. I can come back and change this later on. So then it asks us for a project ID. It gives us this rather strange one, but I'm going to change this to something else. Now if you're on the free plan you can only create a public project. Once you're on the pay plan you can create private projects. Your project is visible and can be cloned only if you provide someone else with the link. So provided you don't give them the link, then it's essentially not really a public project. But you know, at the end of the day, it's free, so it's considered to be a public project. So let's create this as a public project. I'm going to create that. Okay, and then here we are in our editor with absolutely nothing there, okay, which is the best thing and the worst thing in the world. So on the left hand side we have what will be our elements tree. Okay, so this is going to essentially describe the content that's in our page, and at the minute Nordcraft is telling us that we've essentially got a ghost town, there's no elements, so we're going to need to add them. So we can either do that by clicking here, we can click up here, or we can press I on the keyboard. I'll just click here for this one. Now what we see here is a list of all of the types of elements that we can add into our page, and these are what we call HTML elements. Now HTML is one of the key elements of building web apps, websites. In fact, every single website in the world, every web app when you're browsing the web, is built with HTML to describe its content. And that is what we're going to use in our app as well, because Nordcraft, even though it gives you a visual editor to work with, uses the native concepts in web development to enable you to build your systems. So everything that you're learning here is applicable to the web platform natively. It's not trying to hide away anything from you. It's not trying to abstract any technical details away from you. You are working directly with the native concepts on the web. And HTML is a key one because it describes what's on the page. So we've got lots of elements that we can use. Most of these you will very rarely, if ever, use. There's some that you will use quite a lot and some that we'll use all the time. And one of those is the div element. And originally it's called div because originally it was used to describe a divider. But now it's generally considered to be a container element. So as Nordcraft says, it's a generic container for content used for layout and styling. So in other words, you put it on the page and then it's used to then contain and control the elements that live within it. So what we're going to do is, at the minute we've just got a page, a blank page, so we're going to add a div, and everything is going to be contained within that div, that container, rather than it just being sat directly on the page. And that way we have more control over the content. So let's select this, and we get our div added to our tree. And if you look at the line along the top, that represents the new div container on the page, and it's filling the entire width of the page but not the height. It has no height effectively, and if we drag it in and drag it out again, essentially we're always getting the full width of the page with this div element. But obviously we want it to be 100% of the height as well as 100% of the width. So now we come to the next fundamental element of the web platform when building web pages and building web apps, and that is CSS. Now it doesn't even matter what CSS stands for, just think of it as styling. So your HTML is used to define the content of your web page or your web app. CSS is used to define how it is styled. So each element can be styled in any way that you like using CSS. Now, CSS is a kind of a scripting thing, but Nordcraft is enabling us to use a visual editor, because CSS can get fairly in depth, and by having a visual editor like Nordcraft to make it much simpler to define, then it's going to make the job much faster, much quicker, much easier to learn. So with our div element highlighted on the left, we can come over to our panel on the right where we get the styling option here, and this is where we will style the element. Now we can do lots of things here, and we will go through a lot of these, but let's keep things super focused for now, and let's come to the size, because we need to set a height. Now, because the page can grow and shrink depending on the screen size or what the user does with the browser, we don't want to set it to a static height, because what we really want to do is to make it fill all of the height of the page. So what we're going to do is set it, rather than a static height, we're just going to set it to be 100% of its container. Now, because the div is the first element in the page, then its container is the page itself. So we're saying this container needs to be 100% of its container, which is the page. Now, although it's by default as standard set the width to 100%, let's remove any ambiguity and let's set it directly as 100%, and that way we know that this div is always going to be 100% of the width of the page. And again, if we just stretch that out, we can see with the blue outline that it's going to fill the entire height of the width of the page, no matter how much we stretch it out. So let's put a background color into our div, not on the page but on the div, and to do that we come down here where it says background, and we're going to click plus. So I'm just going to use the color picker just to select a blue color. That'll do, something like that, okay? And now we've got the background. Now that's the background of the container, not of the page. So if we change this width and height now to be 50% instead of 100%, we can see that our container is now just mirroring what we've set that to. And as we stretch this out, it stretches, but it's only ever going to be 50% of the width and 50% of the height. Okay, but we obviously want it to be 100%, so we'll undo those last few changes, and we can do that using Command Z or Command Z, or Control Z, Control Z if you're on a PC, or we can click these buttons down here, and let's just take it back to where we had no color background, but we had 100% height and width. So now what we need to do is to add a container within this container that's going to hold our form. So if we look in the original, we can see that we have a centralized or somewhat centralized container that has our form in there. So we go back to the page and we need to add a container within this one. So to do that, we highlight it, and then we can either press plus or we can press I on the keyboard, and then we're going to add another container, another div container. Now at the moment we don't see anything because it's placed right in the top left hand corner. We want it centralized. So the way to do that is we need to come to the top level container, and if you look at this section here for layout, we've got display, and if we drop that down, we get lots of different options. Again, CSS is very extensive and Nordcraft gives you access to pretty much all of it, but let's keep things super focused on what we need to do. The most common way, and the way that we've generally built things on the web in recent years, is using what we call Flexbox, and it just makes laying out your page and your elements much easier. So in this case we're going to select Flex, which means that we're going to use Flexbox, and that opens up a whole series of options here, and one of them is where we want to place the content that's within this container. So we want to place our immediate container, this div here, in the center of its container. So what we need to do is just click that, and then that will place it in there. So now if we select this one, we can see, even though it's only a dot, because we haven't given it a width and a height, is that it is placed in the center. So what we'll do then, we'll give it a static width and height for now. We can always change it. And there are various different units of measure that we can use to size things in Nordcraft or in CSS in general, but probably the best way to do it is using what we call rem, which is REM. So we'll get used to this as we go through. The different units of measure, as I say, there's pixels, there's all sorts of things, but rem is definitely the recommended one. Don't get caught up on these details. It's all pretty straightforward. You'll get used to it. Let's set the width to 30 rem. So that's about right. We can see what it sized it to. And let's say the height is 22 rem. Okay. As I say, don't get caught up in it. It's just a unit of measure that you will soon realize what it is. We want to set it to 1 rem. We want to see what 1 rem looks like. That's pretty much it. Okay, we can also do 0.5 rem. Okay, so you can get fairly atomic on how you want to size things. So again, let's go back to 22 rem, and yeah, we've got roughly the size of a form that we have here. So let's give it the background color similar to what we've got in this one. So again, we select the form container element, and if we come down here to background, and this time we've got some preset colors. So we've got grey, grey 50, grey 100. Let's just set it to grey 50 for now. So if we preview this in its own tab, we can see that there is a slight background colour against that white background. Is it strong enough? Probably not. We probably need to maybe make that a little bit darker. So there's different grey options that we've got that we can use. So let's say grey 100, and that'll probably do it for us. If we refresh, yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay. So there's our form that we've got. So now what we can do is to look to add our elements on there. So the first thing is we've got a text label that says login. So what we can do then is to add that into this container. Remember, this is our form container. And so we'll press I on the keyboard. And this time what we're going to do is add what we call a span. Now a span is very similar to a div. The difference with it, and the keyword in this description here, is inline. Generic inline container for text or other elements. So we will select a span, and by default we get a text label in there, and so what we can do is highlight that. We can double click inside the form and we can say log in. Okay, now it's not really the size that we want if we look at the original, so we need to make it much bigger than that. So we'll go to the span where we can style it, and we'll come down here to where we've got font, and we can click on font, and then we can set the family that it belongs to. Again, that's something that you can do by default in Nordcraft. The font is Inter. So let's set a size, and again we can set it based on some predefined. So let's have a look. As we scroll through, we can sort of see what we've got. I think extra large will do it. And then under weight, we can then maybe pop that into bold. So So let's just scroll down here. Let's say font weight bold. Okay, and that's roughly what we've got in our original here. Now, what we've got is that the text is now butting up right against the edges of our form, which we don't want. I mean, we want to give it some space so it's much more easy on the eye, much better UX, as they say. So what we need to do is to add some what we call padding around the edge of the form so that the content of the container has some space between itself and the outer edges of that container. So what we do then is come to our div, which is our form div, and what we can do is put some padding, and that is what these are for here. This is for horizontal padding along the sides, and this is for vertical padding top and bottom. So what we can do then, let's say that we're going to say that we want the horizontal padding to be, let's say 2 rem. I think that's good enough, and we'll set this one to be, let's try 2 rem as well. I think that's about right. I think that will do us. Is that similar to what we've got here? Yeah, I think it is. So I think that that's good enough at the minute. Okay, so that's our padding added. So now we need to add in our label here and our input box. So let's put the label in first. So again, we'll have a span. So we'll do I, and then we'll search for span, and we'll select it. Okay, and this time this one will be called, we can type it in here, or we can come over to the right hand side. So let's do it here. We can say email. So now we've added this label, we'll notice that they're butting up against each other, directly one on top of the other, which is not what we have here. We have some spacing, some gap spacing. So we want to make sure that there's some spacing between this element and the next element. So the way that we do that is on our form container is we give it what we call gap spacing. And what gap spacing essentially does is to say that we want so much spacing between the direct children elements, the direct child elements of the container that we're defining here. So again, we'll go to the form element. We do need to set this to flex under display to get this option. And then this here, this setting here, as Nordcraft tells us, is to set the gaps between rows and columns. So what we can do here is to say that we want, let's say 1.5 rem of gap spacing, and this moves things down there, okay? So now what we need to do is to add in our input box. So let's do that. So we come here and we say that we want to add an input box. Accepts user input in a form. That's great. Now look what's happened there is it's essentially applied that gap spacing that we just gave the container, and it's applied it between the email and the input box. Now we don't want that. We want, if we do have any gap spacing, we want it to be quite small, nothing like that. Okay, and now the reason why it's applied that is because, as I said before, it's applying that gap between each of its descendants, each of its child elements. So to prevent that from happening, we need another container which is going to contain the label and the input, and then that will control the gap spacing between those rather than the outer container. So to do that, I'm going to right click on this span on the email label, and I'm going to select wrap in an element. And this time I'm going to select a div, and so now the email now belongs inside of another container. And so now I want this input to belong in there as well, so I can just close that up and I can just drag it inside, and the line tells me that's what's going to happen. So if you look now, is that actually there's now no gap space in between these two rather than what we had before. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to make sure that that is also set to flex, just in case we need to set anything else. In fact, let's set some gap spacing between those two. Let's set it to be, let's say 0.5 rem. Okay, now at the moment the input box isn't really visible on the page because it hasn't got any styling on it. So let's apply some styling on the input box now. So again, I'm going to apply the flex on there. Okay, I'm going to set the height. So let's say the height is 2 rem. So it's quite, but actually we could make that a little bit bigger, 2.5 rem for example, because they are quite large on the page there. It also has a blue outline on there, or what we call a border. So what we can do here is we can come down to this section here that says borders. We can click plus, and then we can set the color. We can leave the rest of it as is, and let's say we're going to set this to be a blue using the built-in Nordcraft colors, blue 600. That will do us as well. So now we've got an idea of what this looks like. Now it's kind of blocky. If we look at the original, they kind of got rounded edges there, so we can do that using radius. So again, with our input selected, if we come down, we see this option under borders for radius. I'm just going to set that to be 0.5 rem. Okay, and then we get these rounded edges here. Okay, probably the gap spacing is a little bit too big perhaps. I mean, this is just part of the refinement that you do. So let's go to here and let's reduce the gap spacing just that little bit. Let's say 0.3 rem. Yeah, okay, that's a little bit more like it. So if we now run this within the editor and we can start to type things out. Now, a couple of things. First thing is we don't want that button up to the edge. We want to create some space. We generally use padding for that. So let's come to the input and let's create some horizontal padding of, let's say, 0.5 rem. Okay, and then let's run that again, just make sure that's what we want. Yeah, that works, that's fine. We've got a similar thing there. Yeah, something similar. Okay, let's pause that. And one of the other things you'll notice on here is that when we actually click into a box or we tab into a box, we get the more thickened outline to give us a clue that this is the box that's been highlighted, that has the input, or what we call focused. So we need to set a style that when the input box is focused, that we get a slightly different border. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit deeper into styling here. So again, we make sure that the input box is selected, and then on the right hand side we've got, so far we set a height, we've set it as flex, we've got some padding, we've got some borders, etc. But now what we need to do is to give it a style for when something happens, some condition happens that we want that style to change in. In this case, it's when the input box is focused. So if you look up here, we've got a style that says default. And that's exactly how that element is going to be styled, whatever's in the default. But we also need to give it a style to say when this box is focused, that the user has input in there, then we need to change some part of its styling. So what we do, we add a new style here. Okay, and we get some options here, pseudo classes. Again, some of this is CSS terminology, don't worry about it. We just simply need to tick this box to say that when it's focused, or what we call focus visible. And so now we have two different styles. We have the default and we have the styling of what happens when the input box has focus. Now anything that we don't set in here to override the default will be styled as per the default. So what we're doing is essentially overriding anything that is set in the default based on when this condition happens. And so all that we need to do is to come down to borders, add a border, and if you look here, we've got the width of 1 pixel. So that's again a unit of measure, that kind of more of an atomic unit of measure to keep things really small. So at the minute the border width is 1 pixel, 1px, but we want to make it 2px so that it's a bit thicker. So we'll do that, we'll change that. Okay, and we want to make sure it's the right color, the blue 600 that we had before. Okay, and so we can see what happens actually when we flick between these two settings. So that's showing us what happens when it's focused. Go back to default, focused, we can see it exactly what happens. So if we now run this in the editor and we click into there, we can see that it changes, tab out of it, we can see that that works. So that's how we set different styles based on different conditions, and there's a lot more that you can do, but let's keep things super focused, super clear at the minute. So one thing that we need to do with this email input is to make sure that it only accepts an email entry. And so again, make sure that the input is highlighted on the left. On the right, we're going to styling, but this isn't to do with styling, this is more to do with behavior and events. It's not really to do with events, so it's got something to do with this middle option, which is attributes, which we can get to by clicking it at the top, or we can press A. And if we look here, we've got attributes, and it gives us type value placeholder. Now, attributes are a HTML concept which enables you to set something which changes the behavior of that element. So in this case, what we want it to do is to tell it the type of input that we want. So if I click on this, and we can see we've got an option for email, and that's what I want. I want the type of input into this box to be email. Now if we look in our original, if we just get rid of that text, we can see that if there's nothing entered, that we get this piece of text here. This is what we call a placeholder, and you can set that using the placeholder attribute. So again, we'll just set that there. We've now pretty much set up our input box here. So what we'll do, we'll copy all of this for our password. So we'll copy this container here. And what we'll do to do that is we can either do the the command C, command V, but in this case we'll just do command D, and that copies the highlighted element underneath the current one. So let's do that. Okay, and now we've got a copy of this. So we'll change the text. Again, we can do that over here, or we can double click in here and change it. Okay, and then we need to change some of the attributes in this input box. So the type isn't going to be email this time, it's going to be password. And the placeholder we want to be password. Now notice it's applied the same gap spacing as we had up here for our form container. So that's got a gap spacing of 1.5 rem for all of its immediate children. Now we don't really want that. We want these to be a bit closer to give a visual indicator that they should be together. So again, in order to override that control of the parent, what we need to do is to add these into their common container. In other words, place these into their own div, and then that control the layout rather than the outer form div. So what I'm going to right click on this first one, and I'm going to select wrap in an element, and this one's going to be a div, and then I open that up and we can see it's contained it, and then I just need to drag this one within there. Now look, they've shoved it up, if that's a technical term, right underneath each other, or the password right underneath the email. So we do want some gap spacing, we just didn't want all of that gap spacing. So we come to the now container that we've got for this one. We're going to need to make sure that we set it to be flex display, and then we can set some gap spacing, and let's say that we just want 0.5 rem, maybe a little bit more. Will 1 rem do it? I think, yeah, it's better. Okay, so we get some gap spacing, but nothing like we had before, and that more closely matches what we've got here. So there's not much left to do now with our form other than add our button. So let's do that. So we will add that into our main form. So I'm going to do I, and I'm going to say button. Now that's good because it's taken on the same gap spacing as what we had before, so that's absolutely fine. At the minute we just got text, or button text, that it's given us by default, and we've got no color, we've got no styling whatsoever. Let's first of all start by changing the button text to be log in. And we need to size it. It needs to be bigger than that. So let's set the height to be 2 rem. Let's see how that does us. Maybe a little bit bigger. Let's go for 2.5 rem. Maybe 2. Yeah, too big. So let's do 2.25. Let's split the difference. Okay, now we don't want the text to be at the top, we want to be in the center. So in the button we can, again, we're going to need to display flex, and then we get the option to place it in the middle of the button. Okay, so now we need to set the background of the button, so we can come down here to the button. We will set it to be our blue 600 color. Okay, and now we've got the background set. Because we now got a blue background, we don't really want the text to be black. We want it to be white or some kind of grey color at least. So what we can do then is we can come down to here where we've got the text. Underneath the font we've got the color to set the text. Okay, and in this one I'm going to set it to white, which is a built-in color. Okay, all good, apart from that we've got square edges again, whereas we've got rounded edges there. So we'll do the same thing again on the button. We'll come down to radius and we'll set that to be 0.5 rem, and then we've got a nice rounding of our corners just like we've got with the input boxes. Okay, so at the beginning we set our form to be a static height. Now what we can do is just let it fall to be the height of the elements that it's contained within it. So to do that, just come up to the form div, and where we've got our height we can just get rid of that. Okay, and then we can see it's just sized it, taking into account all of the contained elements, including the padding, just to give us a nice straightforward form to align with the elements. Now the other thing as well is that this has a radius on it as well, so we can certainly change that on the form. So on the form element itself we can come to radius, and again we'll just put 0.5 rem and just assign that. Okay, so that's pretty much our form layout done. So we can see what's happening there is that we're building up a tree of elements. Each container controls to some extent the behavior, the styling and the positioning of its child elements, and then as you go further down the tree, then each container has control of its child elements, and so that's how we're able to put this together. Now what we haven't done is hooked up how we can deal with the inputs, how we can manage those, the values entered into those inputs, and that's what we'll be going into in the next video. So thanks for watching, thanks for sticking with me. Again, there's a link in the description if you're interested in the upcoming courses that I'm making. If you want to sign up for the waitlist for those, you can do that there, and I will see you in the next one.